I think we'll begin. I think everybody's in. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us today. My name is Ian Knockholds, and I am the local council advisor for the Wiltshire Association of Local Councils. Today's um, theme for the session is around practical hints and tips for your council around Assertion 10. I've been getting a lot of queries around sort of data compliance and website compliance, and there is nobody better than our speaker today, Mark Tomkins, the founder and creative director at Aubergine. And Mark's very kindly given his time. He's going to give us a presentation. Then when Mark's finished his presentation, we will have an open session for questions. So if anybody has got any questions, then that would be the perfect time to ask them. And then I'm hoping before the end of the session today, we'll have an opportunity to have an update from the Wiltshire and Swindon SLCC branch as well, before we perhaps go to an open session if anybody's got any more general questions that I might be able to help you with, or that perhaps anybody else on the call has got experience of dealing with. But I think without any further ado, I'd like to hand over to our speaker today, Mark Tomkins. Just before I do, I actually have to say that I'm sure many of you will be familiar with Mark, not just because of his work at Aubergine, but because he's done a lot of online training sessions, particularly around websites. Mark is going to be speaking at our conference on September the 10th, which I'm going to shamelessly plug later in the session. But I have to say that Mark, as a sort of a resource for the local council sector, Mark never charges for his training sessions, so that means I don't have to pass a charge on to you, which is something that I appreciate, and hopefully, another benefit of membership of the association. So a little thank you there for Mark. But anyway, that's enough of me talking. Mark, do you want to take it away on the old
Absolutely,
Assertion
Ian.
10?
That's incredibly kind of you. If I can ask you to stop sharing so that I've got some slides to go through. So, what are we going to be talking about today? Well, you might imagine that the subject of anything technical when it comes to parish and town councils can often create a little bit of worry, consternation, concern, because very often these technical things come into our parish and our town council sector, and I think for the most part, we get a good go at grasping these sorts of things, but it's often they are very technical, being bestowed upon a group of people who don't necessarily have the technical resource that maybe there is in the commercial world. So the idea behind today is that I'm going to explain what exactly Assertion 10 means to your council, whether you're a small parish council or a large town council. I'm going to explain what Assertion 10 means, because I'm sure you've seen it bandied around. Now, I've got some slides. Basically, Assertion 10 is an element that came in as part of SAP 2025, so the Small Authorities Proper Practices Panel, formerly JPAG Practitioner's Guide, and it relates to some specific technical things to the way councils operate online, specifically around email and domain names and some best practices there, and also our old friend website accessibility compliance, as well as some new things, specifically IT related. I'm going to go through each aspect individually. We're going to be spending about 25 minutes doing that, and then be more than happy to have a short session on some questions. So what's it all about? As I mentioned, 2025 edition of Practitioner's Guide, as we all know it, states that by AGAR next year, the council must operate from a council-owned domain name email address. Now, I think it's worth mentioning at this stage that very often these guides, these documents, these pieces of instruction, legislation, whatever you want to call it, that come out, often the people who write them don't necessarily refer to technical people like me to bridge the gap between what it means and the language that most people use on a day-to-day basis. And so what happens is you end up with these vague descriptions that people interpret incorrectly or slightly differently. The idea behind today is to give you some tips so that those councils that need to make some changes ahead of AGAR next year go away with the right information so that you don't waste time and you don't waste any money. So you must, as a council, operate from a council-owned domain name, and the website must continue to meet the accessibility regulations of the current standard, which are currently something called WCAG 2.2 AA. In addition to that, councils must have an IT policy. So those are the big three. Obviously, there is a reference to continued compliance with GDPR and Data Protection Act, but we all know that anyway. So this Assertion 10 really brings together the kind of a short précise explanation of what best practice online looks like. And as I've mentioned before, it's got to be in place by AGAR next year because it's Assertion 10, which means that when you complete your AGAR documents next year, you've got to put a positive assertion to say, yep, we've done it. So let's dive into the detail. There are going to be lots of slides here, and Ian will share them with all of the attendees afterwards. I'll make those available. So there'll be going to be some slides that I sort of skim through a little bit. Got lots of words on them. I'll précis them in this presentation, but you'll have the bit more detail on the slides themselves. So essentially, Assertion 10, digital and data compliance. And by AGAR next year, every authority must have a generic email account on an authority-owned domain name. So what do I mean by that? Well, I mean, if you are the clerks operating as clerk@abcparishcouncil.gov.uk or clerk@abcparishcouncil.org.uk. Now, there are differences with those domain name suffix bit, but what is quite explicit is that you must no longer use free email services. So, for example, abcparishclerk@gmail.com, abcparishcouncil@outlook.com. These generic services must not be used moving forward. Now, historically, that's how particularly small councils have operated because they were fairly easy to set up and they were free. But why is this important? Why must you move away from these free email services? Well, put simply, the council does not own those platforms or those domain names. Gmail, Yahoo, Hotmail, whatever you want to call it, you don't own those domain names. Google does, Yahoo does, BT does, Microsoft do. And the requirement states that the council must operate an email from the domain name it owns, because you own that data. You don't own the data stuffed within Gmail or Yahoo or Hotmail. It's not yours. It's Google's, it's Yahoo's, it's Microsoft's, and that's a problem. You've got no legal right over that data. You use it, it's there. They're emails that you've created or received. But getting access without the logins, you have no rights, no legal rights to be able to get access without the logins. And therefore, essentially, you are creating a break in data. It also potentially creates GDPR exposures, especially when it comes to things like freedom of information or SAR, subject access requests. But actually, at a more broad level, those are the reasons why from a technical and legal standpoint. But more broadly, you don't own those domain names, which means there's not really any authenticity to your message. Anybody right now could go on to google.com and create a brand new Gmail address that's free, and you could call it marktomkinsparishcouncil.com, gmail.com. Nobody's checked me. Nobody's checked that I'm a parish council. There's been no validation. So there's no authenticity to my message. So setting up those, or rather stopping those free email addresses, is a good thing because it's going to improve the overall authenticity of your message. Now look, on the screen right now, there's lots of specific detail that's written under Assertion 10 where it specifically talks about the elements. You've got to meet your legal requirements for your website in terms of accessibility compliance. The website must continue to publish, have the documentation that you must publish under the Freedom of Information Act or Transparency Code. And of course, you've got to continue to comply with GDPR and DPA regulations. There's some specifics here. It's defining the elements. Now, parish meetings, I don't know whether we have any parish meetings on the session today, but for the most part, you are excluded from the majority of these things, but you are going to need an IT policy. So what is an IT policy? Well, it explains really how everybody involved with the council, clerks, members, staff, how you conduct your business online in a secure and legal way when you're using the IT equipment or software. But it can relate specifically to the authority-owned software and hardware, as well as personal equipment. We'll come to the detail of the IT policy in a little while. I'm going to go back to domain names. So what is the domain name? Well, it's your address on the internet. I know this might sound basic 101, but it's worth explaining. A domain name is the very top of the tree. It's from where everything hangs. Your address on the internet. So here you go. This is where Aubergine are based. We're here in Leighton Buzzard in Bedfordshire. Our town council is officially called Leighton Linslade. So as you can see there, the address is leightonlinslade-tc.gov.uk. That's its web address. And the email address matches that. The generic one is info@leightonlinslade-tc.gov.uk. So it's your address on the internet. Now, people then say to me, well, why should we have a .gov.uk domain? We've got a .com or a .co.uk or a .org. Well, I'll explain a few things here. Best practice is to have a .gov.uk domain because you are one of you parish town councils, you're one of the very few groups of organisations to be able to qualify for a .gov.uk domain being in tier 1 government. It's the ultimate official address on the internet. It gives you elevated security, improves your compliance obviously, and also improves things like compliance with GDPR, FOI and SAR situations, as well as the added security benefits. It's much more professional and improves that authenticity of message online. And you are benefiting from the elevated levels of security because only authorized registrars, such as Aubergine, who have to go through an enormous amount of checking, validation and process by the government's digital service before we can manage .gov.uk domains. So you're benefiting from our investment and our time and our skill being able to give you these domains. Now, a .org.uk domain, it's not on the .gov, but it's still an official .uk domain. It's acceptable as well. You do have a reasonable level of security with it, and it does help you with compliance. And obviously, if the council owns that domain name, then you are meeting your Assertion 10 compliance, especially if you are operating from an email point of view. Best practice looks like your web address being on such and such a parishcouncil.gov.uk and your email address is being clark@ such and such a parishcouncil.gov.uk. The same goes for .org.uk. Now, there are obviously other domain name suffix, .com, .co.uk, .org, but these are not best practice. Yes, they still, strictly speaking, meet your Assertion 10 compliance as long as the domain names are registered in your name, the council's name, but they are not UK jurisdiction. .com is an international /US suffix for companies. .org, international /US suffix for organisations. .co.uk, UK version of companies, not governmental organisations. Now, look, as I've mentioned before, best practice, the good work that the Cabinet Office did over the last year, where they managed to create some funding for lots of parish and town councils to move over to a .gov.uk domain, that ended in January this year. But at Aubergine, we have carried on That, and we are now providing .gov.uk domains, and heavily discounted, I might add. But there are some rules. Domain names need to be defined in a very specific way. So, for example, for parishes, on the screen there, you'll see there are essentially 3 different ways that you can have your domain name. You can't just make it up. You can't just have smithfield.gov.uk. Those days are gone. That is not permitted anymore. You've got to have location and entity. Now, on the screen, I'm not going to go into these details now, but on the screen will be the exact versions of the domain names that you are permitted. When you have a .gov.uk domain, not only do you get that authenticity of message and a better online security, but you can also access quite a lot of really good free government services by having a .gov.uk email address. Not many people know this. You can use the GovPay online payment system. You get access to National Cybercrime Agency early warning system, and also lots of other digital services. So there are lots of benefits for moving over. So here's a recap, guys. Council-owned domain name for your website address. That's got to match. Council-owned domain name for the official of your email. Now, I'm going to bust a myth. I have seen a lot of councils, a lot of local council associations going out there and saying everybody must have a .gov.uk domain name, and everybody, including councillors, must have a .gov.uk email address. I'm afraid that just simply isn't correct. The council must have a council-owned domain name. The council must operate, the clerk must operate from a council-owned email address. That's it. If you want to have your other staff and your councillors using domain-based email, good, because that's best practice, and it really is. And quite honestly, when you're looking at organisations that are providing mailboxes for up to 20 different addresses on a .gov.uk domain at about £50 a year, there is no financial reason why you should not be offering your councillors .gov.uk email addresses, because you've got to have one as the clerk, so that's £50 a year. You've got 19 free email addresses that would more than cover your average parish councillor listing. So cost is not a barrier. The other thing that is really important to pay attention to is everybody must stop using personal email addresses. I've spoken to a couple of councils today where the clerk was operating from their personal email address. This must stop. This is against GDPR, and it is not going to be compliant with Assertion 10. So, last bit about domain names. If this is new to you and you are about to plan for this, but you just don't have the budget to be able to do it, and by the way, you say to me, Mark, okay, so what's all this going to cost? How can I get from here to being compliant? How much is it going to cost me? It's going to cost you £100 per year for the .gov.uk domain, or £30 for .org.uk, and it's going to cost you about £50 for up to 20 email addresses per year. Now, the website, which I shall come on to in a minute, must continue to meet the accessibility standards, and you should not be pointing a .gov.uk domain to a website that doesn't meet those standards. These standards have been around a very long time. 2018 they were written, compliance by 2020. The regs rose in October this year to 2.2. So you've got to have this. You've had to have this for a long time. But you might as well look at doing it in one go, especially ahead of AGAR next year, because, as I've mentioned before, on AGAR time, you're going to be checked against it. Is the clerk operating from domain-based email? Have you got an IT policy? Does your website meet accessibility standards? It's as simple as that. What's the risk? Well, risks are possible audit failure, possible challenges from members of the public, and if you have a .gov.uk domain but you aren't operating in the correct way, you obviously risk the loss of your .gov.uk domain, which would be bad. Now, on my slides here, we're not going to have time to go through the website accessibility tips. I know many of you have been to some of my previous webinars for Ian on keeping up to date with your website accessibility publishing techniques. There's a few on the slides here that you can take away afterwards, but I'll be doing some more of these sorts of things at our conference next month. So, I just thought I'd show off. And I did a recent scan on my own parish council's website where I'm a councillor. There you go, no errors. So I'm going to skip through these accessibility tips, but there's lots here for you to take away and keep up to date with. I'm going to finish off by talking about an IT policy. What is it? Okay, it is a document that provides a simple place that defines the rules about how you as a council operate staff, councillors, even volunteers within your IT realm, whether that's hardware, computers, tablets, phones, and software. Now, this really should include not just authority, parish and town council owned devices, but also personal equipment. If the councillors are using their personal phones with their .gov.uk email address on it. So surely there's templates, right? This is a complicated thing. How are you expected to know what it all means? Well, sort of. The policy is a reflection of the council's own practices, its own software, its own hardware, its own way of doing things. Now, these templates can help you start to think about the important elements to include in your policy, but they are just that. They are thought-provoking. They can't be copy and paste. So what do we need to include in it, or why? Well, you've got to include it because you've got to basically state how you operate online in terms of email, your data practices, how you deal with providing access and then rescinding access when staff and councillors leave, and those sorts of elements, how you store the data. As we know full well, we live in a world now where the most valuable commodity is data. And you might not think as a small parish council you are a target, but I can tell you, if I take off my internet white hat briefly and I put my internet black hat on, parish council is a lovely target. And as a bad actor, as a a hacker type person, I'm going to look at parish council as a target because I know that your IT probably isn't up to much. I know your knowledge probably isn't up to much, but you've got data about a lot of people in your area, and that's valuable to me. So the IT policy is there to make you as a council start to think about your hardware and your software and your robustness. Things to think about: data leaks. What should you do if an email address becomes hacked? A councillor loses access to his email or her email, can't get in, realise it's been hacked. What do you do if documents that you have accidentally shared online? Loss of communications. What happens if you need to rescind access to an email address? What happens if, and so on. Also, things like cybersecurity, making sure that if councillors, staff use personal devices, that at the very minimum, there are minimum standards in terms of things like having antivirus on those computers. Because whilst none of these things are explicit that you must have, you should have them because they are the rules against which you can fall back on if something goes wrong. It's the protocol to fall back on. You're not going to get into trouble for not defining what happens if a councillor's email address becomes hacked. But it's blooming helpful if you say in that document, what we'll do is we'll make sure that everybody changes their password as a first step, so that you've got some instructions to fall back on. We all in this local government sector, we want to be able to say, well, we're going to be working in our parish council for ages. But the truth and the brutal reality is it's quite a sector with high churn. And you might be in the seat today and not in the seat tomorrow. So the incoming clerk, the incoming councillor really does need a set of protocols to follow because they don't know what they don't know. So here we go. What goes into a good IT policy? And we're coming up to the end now. So you've got to define the scope and the purpose. Who does it affect and its purpose? So who does it affect? Council staff, councillors, council volunteers, as an example. What's the purpose? To make sure that the parish council operates online in a secure and compliant way. And then you can start to talk about things like, how long do you keep data? How long do you store it? So that's data retention. What is the process if you become aware of a data breach of any kind? What is the process in terms of rescinding access to technology for your councillors and your staff if they leave? And also another helpful one to include, training. It might just be once a year, but define in the policy how often you're going to make sure that people are aware of the IT policy and the protocols that are part of it. When new councillors come on board and when you have that meeting and they sit there in the front and they present themselves, and councillors are drooling because you're about to co-opt a piece of fresh meat onto the council, making sure that as part of that onboarding process, they've read the IT policy, because you don't want to introduce somebody to the council who's going to behave badly online. So there we go. We've come to the end of what is a little bit of a whistle-stop tour of Assertion 10, but hopefully I've been able to distill it down to the core aspects. It isn't a paperwork exercise. It is a really good thing to do. Certainly an IT policy, a well-considered IT policy, not just protects your council's data and your processes, but it helps promote good digital governance. And it brings everything together. So when you're operating with a good online domain name, so such and such a parishcouncil.gov.uk domain, and everybody else's, and you have that IT policy that says the clerk plus the chair has access to the mailboxes so that they can dive in if they get an FOI or an SAR. That's good. What happens if Councillor Bob leaves? The clerk or the chair can log in and rescind access so that no further use of that official address can happen. These are all really positive things to do. And the cost impact and the time impact isn't that much. It just needs planning. Now, obviously, we're a couple of months out of precept planning. I love this time of year when our clerk sends out the email to all of us councillors and she says, get the date in the diary to start budget and precept planning. I like that, because what that says to me is this is an opportunity to improve the stuff that we've done in the last year. This is an opportunity to look back and go, yeah, this was okay, but we could do better. And obviously with some of these things being compliance, these are things that we've got to do.